Ahoy! The expansion brings plenty of changes to damage output, especially in PvE due to the removal of Bane. So everything about DPS has changed, and on top of that we're also getting artifacts which shuffle things around even more. In this video we'll be looking at PvE DPS under optimal circumstances, so 5 Constitution, as much Empower as you can possibly fit in with things like your Ring, Oblivion and Honing Stone, and everything else that optimizes the damage output. While some things stay the same, there are some very unexpected outcomes here. This data wasn't collected by me, it was collected by someone who would like to stay anonymous, but I can assure you that their work is thorough. These tests are done on target dummies by getting them down to 0 health, and that affects some things that I will talk about later in terms of overall DPS output, and then they are factored against the different weaknesses and all that stuff that comes in afterwards, as well as the potential buffs and empowers that you can have. There's something important that I need to point out before we get into the numbers. The tests were done with 3 perkers, typically with Rogue or Vicious, plus Attunement, plus either Keenly Empowered or Refreshing Move. But in case of the artifact, you can only change 1 perk, and the perk that was usually changed here, unless it was already on the weapon, was adding a gem slot. This is extremely strong, but I'm not sure if it's actually intended that this is possible, so some of the artifact numbers may drop on life if they end up removing that option. So nothing here is final yet, this is an overview of the current state. As for the attributes, they were purely invested into damage perks, with stat splits being as equal as possible for weapons that had split stats. Along with that, every weapon that doesn't already have int scaling also got 50 points of int, because you get 5% base damage through that by just having a Rune Glass bleed on the enemy, which is very easy to apply, and it's just a massive consistent damage increase, which towards the top end is more than investing some more attribute points into your main point. Wherever suitable and effective for more DPS, the 25 point capstones were also used. We're going to pull a bit of a reversal on you here and show you the full damage per second chart for Angry Earth specifically right away. That's because there are a ton of extra conditions here that can actually shift things around, so you shouldn't just take this number that you see right here as gospel. Everything that is highlighted means there is some sort of outlier or specific factor here that's important to talk about. The tiers, by the way, were added by me. I displayed them in intervals of 2000 damage difference to keep it even between all of them. There was a complaint last time with the tiers. Keep in mind that slash damage and fire damage have a significant advantage against Angry Earth, so that obviously affects the charts here. We will look at the other mob types later on. Let's begin with the Warhammer, which once again ended up at the tragic bottom end. This time we have 2 versions. We have the normal Warhammer and we have the Spark version. The normal version deals 6500 damage, the Spark version deals 6900 damage. The combo that was used here was a light attack straight into Mighty Gavel for constant resets, just doing that over and over. Question is if that is even effective. The problem with Mighty Gavel is that the animation is actually fairly long, and it may not actually be more effective than just using light attacks. What is worth keeping in mind, of course, is that this is single target DPS. That applies for everything else afterwards as well. And in a group scenario, the Warhammer gains more DPS simply by hitting multiple targets at once. But it is also possible that there may be more effective combos for the Warhammer specifically, maybe chaining a quick heavy attack into the Gavel, or simply not using Gavel at all. So there is room for improvement here in some ways, though I wouldn't expect the Warhammer to go much higher than it is. The much bigger benefit of the Warhammer in Expeditions will be the new effect from Spark, which is the 50% weaken, which is a massive amount of extra utility. But if you depend on that weaken, you can also have your tank run that. Next up we have the new entry to the list, the Flail. No surprise here, this is not meant to be a DPS weapon, this is very much a utility weapon, so the overall damage output is lower than most other weapons. The Flail deals around 7300 damage. That said, for how much utility it provides, the DPS is actually quite okay, especially when you consider that this weapon has a ridiculous amount of AoE. For example, Arcane Smite is an AoE that even lingers on the ground. Arcane Vortex is a consistent spam of attacks, a flurry of attacks that is also AoE, and Warding Bludgeon is a very quick AoE. With so many AoE damage effects at your disposal, I wouldn't be surprised if this can actually outclass, for example, the Warhammer in terms of AoE clearing. That's also great news for tanks, of course. The Flail artifact was not tested separately, and it would probably have lower damage overall because the perk that you get in terms of damage output is actually horrendous. That is not the case for the Void Gauntlet, and this is also a bit of a problem child, and that's because Tether doesn't work properly on dummies. But even with that, you can see why the normal Void Gauntlet is typically put on the healer. Now, there are interesting situations coming up now with this patch. On one hand, Flail might be used as an offhand by healers because it also comes with empowers and weakens and some other utility, and on the other hand, Lifetaker has an extremely strong effect for other weapons. All of these tests are done only using one weapon, but Lifetaker actually affects the damage of your other weapon, and this is particularly interesting for weapons like Fire Staff or Ice Gauntlet, so their damage could technically end up being buffed through Lifetaker if that's a build you want to run. And that would then create more freedom for your healer to use the Flail if your tank is not using it, so you have more empowers overall. The normal Void Gauntlet deals roughly 7,400 damage, while the Lifetaker version deals 9,800 damage. Lifetaker damage is honestly not that bad, though of course it's also not that much for an artifact weapon. Now we're moving into 8 to 10,000 damage territory, where we have the Musket just barely scraping by with 8,007 damage. Now the Musket is really interesting insofar that it kind of got a bit of an overhaul. It now has no more hit scan, but the projectiles will pierce. And this actually gives us some interesting opportunities in PvE that go beyond what these numbers can tell us. Because while you still don't have extremely high single target damage, you can also ignore most mob mechanics and dungeon mechanics and more freely do damage most of the time, and you can shoot through a clump. If your allies group mobs properly with Grafwell and so on, then you may be able to actually pierce pretty well and do some decent damage to many mobs at once. That said, the Musket is marked in red for a reason. For the Musket as well as other ranged weapons, this assumes 100% headshot rate, same way we have 100% backstab rate with Rogue. Especially with this no longer being hit scanned, that is not necessarily a given. Sure, you'll reach that on certain bosses where you have a very easy headshot spot, but sometimes you just won't be able to focus the crit spot of a target. For example, at Sandworm, which just doesn't have one. While the bow has slightly higher DPS with 8,350, it doesn't come with the same amount of penetration when it comes to consistently shooting through all targets. You can do that with pen shots, but it's just not something that you can frequently do comparatively. On the other hand, a lot of AoE abilities on the bow, like Rain of Arrows, Poison Shot and Explosive Arrow, are more likely to hit groups that are clumped but not perfectly lined up for the Musket. Again, for the bow, the numbers are also based on 100% headshot rate, so in a real scenario they would likely be a fair bit lower. But then again, the bow also has more consistent DPS uptime because it's ranged. The Hatchet looks brutally dethroned here, but keep in mind that this is not the full picture for the Hatchet either. First of all, this doesn't factor in against all odds against multiple targets, so the damage can go up quite significantly here. But this is with the right tree capstone, so if you want to play the Hatchet for safety with Defy Death, then you would lose even more damage. Additionally, there were also some other animation issues with the Hatchet. So overall, this number could definitely be looking a fair bit higher in a realistic scenario. That said, I don't think it's going to compete with the top end here anymore at all, like it used to once upon a time. As for the throwing Hatchet artifact, it may as well not exist. And now things get spicy. At this point, a quick reminder, if you like this video, consider subscribing and clicking the bell. And if you'd like to support my work further, you can do that on Patreon and get early trading and farming tips in return. Because now we are looking at Sword and Shield. And Sword and Shield has fundamentally changed because you can no longer double Bane. Previously, the main reason Sword and Shield was able to keep up in DPS with other weapons was because you could put Bane on both your weapon and your shield for a combined damage increase. But now we have a new artifact. If we look at the normal Sword and Shield DPS, that's 10,000. That's alright. It's bottom of the A tier here. It's not particularly impressive. It's also not bad. But this is also against Angry Earth, so it already has an advantage here. So not really a standout. However, the Butcher is a different story. It ends up in the 4th spot in terms of DPS here, and this is not even its final form. In case you aren't aware yet, the Butcher passive Jagged Whirls applies to both hits of the Whirling Blade Spin, so this stacks 2 bleeds with an attack. These are also affected by the Bloodletting duration increase and have a maximum of 3 stacks, and you can stack them along with Keenly Jagged, so there's so many bleeds going on at the same time. But in this test, the Butcher was tested with Nimble Leather Coat because it gives 10% cooldown reduction, which is a significant damage increase if you're just trying to spam Whirling Blade as much as possible. However, if you were to run Motherwell's Wishes coin, you might actually get higher numbers because you can utilize the Rogue effect from that, and you get Refreshing Move for the cooldown reduction on top of that. It doesn't really matter that you can't get coin to 700 gear score because the gear score of your shield isn't factored in unless they change that in the expansion. If they do, you could also run the Featherweight chest with a Kite Shield for Refreshing Move, but that was outside of the scope of what was tested here. But not only that, the Butcher also comes with Empowered Whirling Blade by default, so against multiple targets, you get an additional 52% base damage increase, which would ramp up the DPS even further, and is especially effective against groups, which I think is where this weapon will generally shine. This is also particularly interesting because it's different from the Greatsword above it, which is generally the best group fight weapon. This doesn't come with the trade-off of taking more damage all the time. Well, other than your slightly reduced armor if you're using a shield. It also comes with a great arsenal of rends and weakens now. I think this is really great to see. The Butcher may be one of the most well-rounded PvP and PvE weapons now. By the way, the Butcher was used with a bloodletting ring here. The next weapon has a bit of a problem with the ring, and that's the Ice Gauntlet, because the ring it was tested with did not have keen awareness, which can now stack with other perks. So while the Ice Gauntlet is sitting at 10,000 damage here, it could actually be a bit more effective. Additionally, against larger mobs, which you for example have in the Savage Divide, the Ice Gauntlet can also more consistently hit with all of the different spikes, which increases your ice spike damage further. Of course, the Ice Gauntlet also makes an excellent offhand due to the ice pylon that just stays around and many other lingering effects, but it has a little bit more competition than before in form of the Lifetaker Void Gauntlet as an offhand now, because that gives you direct damage on your main hand. This is especially true for bosses where ice pylons can cause problems, but of course you can't always use the Lifetaker Void Gauntlet if you're using an artifact in your main hand anyways. The Blunderbuss is sitting at 10,300, still more of a burst weapon than a DPS weapon, and this once again is assuming full headshots, something you will relatively rarely get with the Blunderbuss. However, there's also the artifact version Pestilence. This one is at the very top end of A tier here with 11,846. For this DPS increase, that's pretty irrelevant if you're doing headshots because that is damage over time that is added by Pestilence. In my opinion, that makes the Blunderbuss very, very appealing. Especially as an offhand, even if they nerf the effect with the damage over time, you can kind of just dump the abilities and apply all the dots and then switch over to your main hand and get a very significant DPS increase with strength weapons, which wasn't really possible before to the same degree. It was possible, but not on the scale that it is now. Previously, this kind of playstyle was mostly reserved for Ice Gauntlet offhands. It was tried with Blunderbuss, but was never really something that fully caught on as far as I'm aware. Definitely excited to see experimentation with this one, but we'll also have to see how the passive works after PTR. Due to a lot of new beneficial attribute capstones, the Great Axe is kind of in the middle of the pack here. Cooldown reduction benefits it a lot because a lot of its damage doesn't come from basic attacks but from abilities, and the 350 strength perk giving you more damage on your secondary light attack is also a decent boost because this is one of the few weapons that actually effectively uses this. The abilities used for this are Reap, Execute and Maelstrom. But keep in mind that this is slash damage against Angry Earth, so this is kind of Great Axe's territory. However, the Abyss Great Axe, which is in scaling does void damage, actually ends up higher with 11,100 damage. So if you want to go for the Great Axe, the Abyss is definitely an interesting option that in other territories where slash doesn't have an advantage, overtakes the regular Great Axe much more. The squeeze between those two Great Axes is the previous king of DPS, the Greatsword with roughly 11,000 damage. Definitely not bad if you also consider that the Greatsword also comes with a large amount of AoE damage. However, there isn't really any reason to run the Greatsword as a non-artifact when Serenity exists, other than the reason that you don't have Serenity yet. Serenity takes the third place in the top 3 with 14,367 damage per second. And it's no surprise, after nerfing heavy attacks on the Greatsword over and over, they now decided to completely bloat a weapon with everything that amplifies heavy attacks, also gives an additional empower, and also refreshing move on top of that. This thing is just entirely busted in terms of the perks it has on it, and then you can add a gem to that currently. Now if they remove the option to add a gem socket, then Serenity would actually lose a fair bit of damage. At that point there's a conversation to be had about the safety versus damage of the Greatsword. If you can do almost the same damage with a Great Axe without taking extra damage all of the time, then that may be a better option. With a Butcher without all the extra conditions that I talked about earlier already breathing down its neck, that's also some serious competition. There's another familiar face of ours in the Strength Dex category, and that is the Spear. 11,478 DPS, so definitely towards the top still, and this is of course against Angry Earth, where thrust advantage is a thing, this goes higher. This is with a Cyclone build, by the way, not a sweep build, so you also have some decent AoE damage on top of that, and you have some decent self-heal, which I think is often underrated. At least as an offhand, Spear will most certainly retain its value due to the weakens and rends that it can also apply, so overall still a very solid pick. Scorpion Sting is not a DPS spear and therefore not included here. The Fire Staff is very much up there, the first one in the 12,000 plus damage category with 12,942, but also gets a whooping 30% bonus against Angry Earth. Against all other mobs it's more around middle of the field at 10,000. Like the Ice Gauntlet, this is without a keen awareness ring, so you could squeeze some extra damage out of that, especially with the Fire Staff, which generally works well with crit. The Fire Staff Artifact Inferno doesn't really provide us with the perks that we want, it doesn't really make a significant difference in that regard, And the strength scaling doesn't even work properly insofar that the burns don't scale with strength, so they're ridiculously weak. So, not worth talking about as a whole. And that brings us to the ADS what are you doing? Rapier. It was already strong before, it's even stronger now. Congratulations. Your normal Bis Rapier comes in at 16,709. The Finisher Rapier comes in at 20,784. That is more than 3 times as much DPS as the weakest weapon on this list. The build here is changed, by the way, running Evade, Flurry, and Flourish and Finish, and then all the way down to the end of Flourish and Finish. This is because Flurry is just most of your damage now. Tondo doesn't really do much. You can get the effect mostly from Flurry unless you need the weaken. Yeah, it's just, they keep buffing the same ability over and over and over and over and over, and this is what happens. And now you also have damage immunity while you heal, which you can see how that could be a little bit of a problem in expeditions. You notice that this is not even a damage advantage situation for the Rapier, this is Angry Earth, and also this doesn't factor in that the Rapier can utilize an Ice Gauntlet offhand along with it for even more DPS. I understand, yeah, the Rapier is a single target weapon and that's where it shines and that's what it does effectively, but if you can kill 3 mobs in the same time somebody else can kill 1, then it doesn't really matter that much anymore. The Rapier can do like some partial AoE, and no AoE weapon will consistently hit 3 mobs all the time if they're not super clumped, and the Rapier would also hit all of them. In my opinion, the damage gap with the Rapier has become too far at this point, and they keep buffing it instead of nerfing it for PvE for some reason, which is very, very strange. Finisher also comes with a gem slot by default, so even if the gem slot adding option is removed for other weapons, that doesn't affect Finisher. This is just the DPS that Finisher will do. Instead, it would mean that the gap to the next weapons, which are artifacts currently with a forced gem slot, would get even bigger. So you basically be looking at Fire Staff maybe as the next best option, or maybe Butcher when fully specced out with everything. Once again, the only thing that's holding Rapier back is that bleed stacking with multiple people doesn't work that well, and that it relies on other weapons for things like Rend. Anyways, Rapier guide with Roger soon. Consider subscribing if you're interested in that. Taking a look over to Ancient, we see some notable shifts. For example, the Spark Warhammer goes up a fair bit, with the lightning damage doing its work here. Void weapons in particular have a big showing. The Lifetaker Void Gauntlet goes up to 11,750 DPS, which is much higher than what we had with Angry Earth. Though it is worth noting that in this case this is actually because of the strike damage from this weapon and not the void damage. And the Abyss Great Axe goes to 12,711. Interestingly enough, while they're both dropping in DPS, Serenity and the Butcher actually don't drop much on the charts. They were just pretty far ahead in DPS beforehand, but they're still doing very well here. Against Corrupted, a very common expedition mob type, we see the Spear rise to its old glory with the thrust damage bonus kicking in here. Likewise, we see Pestilence come up here as a blunderbuss, also thrust damage, and of course we see the Rapier doing even more damage because it really needed that. Both Bow and Musket move closer to the middle of the ranks, but some other weapons that also fell off with Ancient also don't recover here, like for example Fire Staff or normal Sword and Shield without the artifact. Against Lost, things are almost back to as they were against the Angry Earth, though the Ice Gauntlet makes its way to the upper tiers. The Lifetaker Void Gauntlet with its 99% strike damage actually can do pretty decent here too. The Warhammer and Flail, even with their strike damage on the other hand, barely gain any damage. In fact, the Flail DPS is lower than it was against Corrupted because the arcane damage component is actually much more important. Against Human we have this almost neutral testing ground where it's only really affected by slash damage and only a little bit, so we're not seeing anything unusual here. What we're seeing mainly is that compared to the Angry Earth, the Fire Staff is significantly lower. For Beast, which is especially relevant for the new expedition, our only factor is thrust damage, especially the Rapier and the Spear and the Blunderbuss are of course very much on top here, and everything else kinda falls in line behind that. Also again a slightly better place for Bow and Musket. It is possible that there was a slight problem with the calculation here for Beast, in which case the bonus damage for thrust would be 5% lower, but at the end of the day it doesn't really matter, the same weapons would still be on top. If you're interested in future updates to this, then consider subscribing and clicking the bell. In the next days I, for example, also have an updated Bruiser guide or build for the expansion, talking about how that will likely look. A massive thank you to the person who did all this testing. If you'd like to support me further, you can do so on Patreon and get early trading and gathering tips for the expansion in return. Thanks to all of my patrons who already do exactly that. And thank you for watching. Dukesloth out.